Good afternoon. Today we are starting Chapter 7, Minnesota's Newcomers. Let's turn to page, I believe it's 124. You will notice on page 124 that you have, across the bottom of your pages, you have a lot of dates and things that happened on those dates. Nope, turn back. Yep, right here. See how we have a timeline of different dates. Some of those dates we need for our very top of our comprehension page. It says the overall chapter we're going to be learning about this. We can fill some in right now. So there's two different things we're going to do on this comprehension page. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to, like that top one says Minnesota becomes a state, and it says year, and there's a blank. We're going to put the year that Minnesota becomes a state. So we want to fill in our years for all 5 of the statements. Then we're going to come back to the front. Once we get all 5 filled in, as we're going through the chapter, we'll come back and we'll put them in order. What happened first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. So for today, we're just filling in years. So if you look at that bottom of your pages, mine's going along the side, what year did Minnesota become a state? So you're going to look at, there we go. You're going to look at your list, and I see down here, and it says, for 1858, Minnesota becomes the 32nd state. So you would want to put 1858 on that line, not the first line where it says year. You're going to put the actual year where it says year. So there are a couple we can fill in just by looking at that timeline. The next one says the Dakota and U.S. government signed the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. If we're looking at the timeline here, we see 2 major treaties between the Dakota and the U.S. government are signed, opening up southwestern Minnesota for American self-settlement. That's their 2 big treaties, Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. So it tells us what year that happened. So you can fill that in. Then we have Minnesota becomes a territory. So look back on your years. What year does Minnesota become a territory? The last 2 we can't fill in yet because it's not on the timeline. We're going to learn about those. Okay, so we're going to be listening to when we can fill those in at this top section. We're not going to get all of them filled in today, so we can't put them in order yet because we're going to need to find those. So it's okay that we don't get it finished today. We will finish it the next time. And they come out. Okay, so let's look at our question for the introductory section. How did Minnesota's population change in the 1850s? What big changes happened? So let's listen for those changes. And we're also going to be listening for that last one. It says European Americans outnumber American Indians in Minnesota for the first time. So that's gonna be in this first section that we're listening to. So listen for what year it flips. So there's gonna be more European Americans than there are American Indians.
Until about 1850, most of the people living in Minnesota were Dakota and Ojibwe. By the 1860s, though, European American settlers were in the majority. They took over the land of the Dakota and the Ojibwe with incredible speed. Before the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota were signed in 1851, about 6,000 European Americans were living in Minnesota. By 1854, their number had increased to 30,000. By 1857, their population topped 150,000. Between 1849 and 1858, Minnesota was the fastest growing place in the United States. It had become one of the most popular destinations, and a great migration of people from east to west known as westward expansion. When Minnesota Territory was created, its American Indian population was far greater than that of the European American newcomers. It didn't stay that way for long, though. A government official, the U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs, kept population records of Native people. According to these records, there were more than 31,000 American Indian people living in and around Minnesota Territory in the early 1850s. Settlers were arriving so fast that by 1855, they outnumbered the Native people who lived there.
Key year to fill in on that top section. Okay, that last line tells us what year European Americans outnumbered the American Indians. We'll look at that last sentence. So back at the beginning of the 1850s, there's 6,000 European Americans living here. Over 31,000 American Indians. Lots of American Indians. But the American Indian population isn't growing, right? As babies are born, people die. And it balances out. So that over 31,000 kind of stays about the same. Shifts just a little bit, but not a lot. There's not a big explosion to their population. It's 31,000, right? Give or take a few. Babies born, people die, balancing out. 6,000 European Americans. What happens to that number of 6,000 European Americans? Adeline? Why does it grow? People are moving into Minnesota. Remember, with these treaties being signed, we get more land. And that land opens up for all those settlers to come in. And people say, oh my goodness, Minnesota is amazing. We want to move there. That is where we want to live. And so that number keeps growing and growing and growing. It's not like the American Indian population that stays the same. European Americans just get bigger and bigger and bigger. It starts out in 1851 at 6,000. It grows to over 150,000 by the end of the decade. So in 9 years' time, 9 years, it grows from 6,000 to 150,000. That is a huge growth. Think about the American Indians living here. At first, they're like, there's a few settlers. Not a big deal. Now, all of a sudden, there's 150,000 settlers. It's become a big deal. Life is going to change drastically. It's going to change for the settlers coming in and how they're living and the life of the settlers. It's going to change the American Indians. Think about those treaties. The Traverse des Sioux and the Mendota treaties. What was the big change that happened to the Dakota? Who remembers what big change happened to them because of those treaties? Now, they sold off their land and were put into the reservations. So instead of having all this land, now they're living on reservations. Still the 31,000 people. And now all that land that they sold to the U.S. government is making room for those 150,000 settlers that are coming in. Big changes happening.
As more and more people arrived, Minnesota changed in countless ways. Life was becoming very different for all the people who lived in this place. Not only for the Dakota and Ojibwe who had been here for centuries, but also for the newcomers who were arriving by the steamboat load.
So, number 2 of that introductory section said, how did Minnesota's population change in the 1850s? So think about what I was just talking about. How did the populations change? Did the Dakota population change? The American Indian numbers change? No. What did change and how? Our next section, transportation in early Minnesota. You need to name 6 means of transportation used to travel to and within Minnesota in the 1850s. So as we listen to how people got around, we're listening for our 6 ways that we can list. We need all 6 ways.
Transportation in early Minnesota. Before the 1800s, there had been 2 main ways to travel through Minnesota, by foot or by canoe. By the 1850s, people had a few more choices. In 1847, steamboats started making regular stops at the village of St. Paul. The boats carried people and supplies. Great numbers of immigrants took trains from the East Coast to Mississippi River towns such as Galena, Illinois, and then boarded steamboats bound for Minnesota. The boats could run only from April to November, when the river was clear of ice.
So as I was listening, I was holding up my fingers to modes of transportation. That first paragraph had 4 ways that people got around. So you should have 4 ways just from that first paragraph. Our next paragraph tells us the 5th way.
Those who wanted to travel to Minnesota during the winter could take a horse-drawn stagecoach from Galena, but it would be a longer trip. The journey could take up to 6 days, compared to 2 days for the steamboat. Snowstorms often made travel impossible and forced passengers and their drivers to find lodging in the cabins of friendly strangers.
The last paragraph tells us our 6th way.
The ox cart was another common form of transportation by the 1840s. It was used mainly by the Métis people of the Red River Valley in northern Minnesota and Canada. The Métis used the ox carts to transport furs, buffalo skins, and other goods from the Red River Valley to St. Paul. A train of ox carts could make the trip in 30 to 40 days.
All right, so you should have all 6 ways. If you don't have it, go back and look at it later. So we're going to keep on moving on. Just remember the first paragraph, there were 4 ways, and the next paragraph had the 5th, and the last paragraph has the 6th way. Now, St. Paul was not what it looks like now. Now it's the big, huge capital of Minnesota. Lots of buildings, lots of people. Back when Minnesota was just being formed, it was just a small town. Very, very different than what it looks like now. They didn't have a school to start off, right? The town is just growing, just developing. So now we're going to see how things develop, looking at how the school develops.
The New England schoolteacher. In July 1847, a young woman named Harriet Bishop stepped off the steamboat Argo and onto the landing at the small settlement of St. Paul along the Mississippi River. Several children were there to greet her when she arrived. She had come to be their new teacher, their first school teacher. Bishop had grown up in Vermont and had trained to become a teacher, one of the few careers open to women at that time. Teaching jobs were hard for women to find on the East Coast, but an organization called the National Board of Popular Education was looking for women to start schools in newly settled lands to the west. Bishop jumped at the chance. Her assignment was to teach the children of St. Paul, which had no school.
So if we look at our comprehension page, it says the New England school teacher, and there are 3 boxes, one for St. Paul, one for the citizens, and one for the schoolhouse. In the St. Paul section, there are 2 lines. You need 2 facts of what the town of St. Paul looked like back then. Then for the citizens, 2 facts of what kind of people were living here. Citizens are the people living in that area. And then the last one is going to be 2 facts about what the schoolhouse looked like when poor Harriet Bishop had to get it set up. And I say poor Harriet Bishop for a reason. You will discover what it was like setting up that first school.
St. Paul was hardly even a town in 1847. The buildings were mostly just log huts. The streets were bumpy and muddy. A few hundred people lived there, and most of them were men. Only a dozen or so families with school-aged children lived in the area. About half of the parents had never learned to read.
So from that paragraph, put 2 facts of what the town of St. Paul was like, 2 facts about what the people living there, the citizens, were like. What kind of citizens lived there? What was the town like? While you're filling that in, we're going to read the next section. don't know why it's not reading it for me. So I will read it out loud. Harriet Bishop knew that teaching children under these circumstances would not be easy, but she seemed to relish the challenge. Here was a field to be cultivated, she later recalled, a garden of untrained flowers to be tended, and the heart raised a thank offering to heaven and cheerfully entered upon its work. So it's not an easy situation she's stepping into, but she's really excited for it. It's like, oh, they've never had a school, never had a teacher. Super excited to be the first one to start it up. So if we look at our next page, it tells us what the school was like. So that's where we're going to fill in our 2 lines, 2 facts for the schoolhouse.
A school for St. Paul. Bishop's new school was an abandoned blacksmith shop. Mud plaster held the log walls together. Small, dirty windows let in hardly any sunlight. Rats and snakes lurked in the corners. She got to work. She cleaned up her schoolroom as best she could and decorated the walls with evergreen branches. Bishop seemed to enjoy her new surroundings. Why should I pine for halls of science and literature when such glorious privileges are mine? She wrote. There was not a spot in Earth's broad domain that could have tempted me to an exchange.
She's a better person than I am. What was that schoolhouse like? When she got there, they said, this is going to be your school. Was it like St. Vincent's de Paul? No, right? I came in, this is my first year in this classroom. I came in and it was ready for me to set up the classroom in the fall. So it would be ready for you guys to come. What was this school like? Yeah, there were snakes and rats slithering around in the corner. There's dirt on the windows. It's dirty and gross. Ew. Is that an easy place? Would you want to come in there to learn? No, I wouldn't want to go in there to teach. I couldn't handle teaching if there was rats climbing all over the place. I would be so distracted and so icked out by it. No, no thank you. Right? But she came in and she said, I got this. I'm going to clean this up and I'm going to make this a place where the students want to come and are able to learn. Pretty amazing. So from that paragraph, take 2 things to talk about what that schoolhouse was like when Harriet Bishop had to set it up. So 2 things about the schoolhouse. Really doesn't like me this time around. Let's see. All right, so it's not letting me play the recording, so I'm going to read that last paragraph. 3 days after arriving in St. Paul, only 3 days, she cleaned that whole building up in 3 days' time. Bishop opened her little schoolhouse. Her first class had 9 students. Oh, that sounds glorious. Only 9 kids I have to teach? But only 2 of them spoke English. The other ones were immigrants that spoke other languages. There were a variety of languages, including French, Dakota, German, and Ojibwe. One of Bishop's students spoke 3 languages and became her interpreter. Whew. So it seems glorious, only 9 students, but they all spoke different languages. So that was another challenge that she had to overcome, and thankfully they helped each other out. Oh, I know that language, I can translate it, I can interpret it, so they can still learn. Not an easy situation for her to come into.
Strong feelings. In addition to teaching, Harriet Bishop was involved in her community in many other ways. She established St. Paul's first Sunday school. She helped organize a group whose members believed that drinking alcohol was harmful and should be illegal. She also led several women's organizations that raised money for community projects. Bishop believed that all these efforts would help civilize the people of Minnesota. Harriet Bishop was just one of a growing number of New Englanders, people from the far northeastern states, who were moving to Minnesota. Many of these newcomers had worked in the lumber industry in Maine and New Hampshire, and they were now looking to make their fortunes off the vast timberlands of Wisconsin and Minnesota. Like Bishop, these New Englanders often had strong feelings about American democracy, culture, education, and religion. They had plans for Minnesota's future. Many of these New Englanders became leaders in the towns that were developing along Minnesota's rivers. Because there were so many newcomers from this region of the United States, Minnesota was often called the New England of the West.
So, as people are coming in, everybody has their own perspectives about how things are happening. So this blue box is telling us different perspectives, right? So we learned some amazing things about Harriet Bishop, but she's human. And we'll see that there's always things that you can find where you go, not the best parts of her came out in certain times. So we're going to learn a little bit about that.
So what? People are people. When you read about Harriet Bishop, who lived more than 150 years ago, you might think, so what? You might be surprised to learn that people today still have strong feelings about her. Some appreciate the positive things Bishop did to improve the community of St. Paul. Others have a negative opinion of her because she said hurtful things about the Dakota people who live nearby. Harriet Bishop, like all people, was complicated. Both the positive and the negative reactions to her deeds make sense if we view them from different perspectives.
So we're first going to learn about how she helped her community, all the amazing things that she did. We've heard about some of it already. We're going to look a little bit more into that.
She helped her community. In the 1850s, when St. Paul was just getting started by European American settlers, Bishop was a leader who helped shape this new community. She loved her chosen home and once said, "If earth has a paradise, it is here." Bishop devoted most of her life to finding ways to make it better. To her, this meant creating opportunities for women. It also meant promoting certain values and beliefs. She participated in at least 8 organizations, including the St. Paul Circle of Industry, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. Many people benefited from Bishop's care and hard work.
She worked really hard to make her new community a good community. Not just for the children in the school, but for everybody living in the community. But she also said some hurtful things about the Dakota people. And we're going to learn a little bit about it now, and we're going to look at it more deeply when we come in a couple of chapters from now. So, in chapter 9, this is chapter 7, so in 2 chapters, we're going to learn about a war that actually happened here in Minnesota. So it happened right in the land of Minnesota. I didn't know about this war until I started teaching this class. So it's a small war, but it did happen, and it made people have very, very strong opinions on things. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 was a painful time in our state's history. It still has an impact on Minnesotans today, and it had a powerful effect on the people who lived through it, including Harriet Bishop. Like most people who see war firsthand, Bishop ended up having very strong opinions about it, strong feelings about it. So think about that. You see the war happening. What happens in wartime? Right? People die, right? You see family members die, people you love dying, you're going to have very strong feelings. So the settlers that were living there had very strong feelings about what was happening. In 1863, she wrote a book called Dakota War Book, or Indian Massacres and War in Minnesota. In it, she called Dakota soldiers names like Savage, Inhuman Monsters, and Heartless Wretch. Bishop's words were influenced by the fear and anger she felt as a result of living in a place that experienced the violence of war. If you're witnessing horrible things happening, you're seeing it from your viewpoint, and you're horrified by it, you will say hurtful things about the people that you think are in the wrong. Everybody has their own viewpoint. The American soldiers have a viewpoint. The settlers have a viewpoint. The Dakota had a viewpoint. The fur traders are involved in this. They have their viewpoint. In chapter 9, we're going to understand how the different groups reacted and behaved and why. So we're gonna learn why the settlers were so upset. It's very horrifying what they lived through. We're gonna understand why the Dakota behaved the way they did, why the US government behaved how it did, the fur traders, everybody plays a role in this. And we're gonna understand these comments that she made a little bit better. Today, though, some believe words like hers contributed to misunderstandings of what really happened in this war. At the time, people were divided over this issue, and that divide still exists today. When you have really strong feelings, sometimes it's hard to see things from other perspectives. People are people. Harriet Bishop did things that affected some people positively and some negatively. In this way, she is like most people who are more complicated than they might seem. All right, 3 branches of government. Who knows, without looking, off the top of your head, what's one of the branches of government? Robbie? Judicial. Judicial has the judges and the courts. What's another branch? Bridget? What branch is Congress a part of? Okay, who knows what branch Congress is a part of? The legislative. The legislative branch makes the laws, and Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate fall under the legislative branch. So judicial has the judges and the courts. Legislative makes the laws with the House of Representatives and the Senate, Congress. What's our third branch? Adeline. So close. Who can pronounce it? Nolan. Executive branch. Legislative makes the laws. Judicial has the courts, the judges, and the executive. Who is at the very top of the executive branch, Kamala? The president. Right? So the president, the vice president, his cabinet, they all fall under the executive branch. All 3 branches are extremely important. There's not one branch that's more powerful than the other branch. They set this up this way to keep everybody honest. So it's not just one branch that has all the power. So they all have to work together. So on your comprehension page, you need to fill in the 3 branches and what each branch does. So let's listen to what it has to tell us.
The 3 branches of government. The federal or national government of the United States has its powers divided among 3 branches. They are called the legislative, executive, and judicial. Each branch has a specific role, and all 3 must work together to keep the government running. When Minnesota became a territory in 1849, 2 of the branches played a role in its establishment. The U.S. Capitol. Legislative. Makes laws. Congress. Senate. House of Representatives.
Good afternoon, students and staff. These are your Tuesday afternoon announcements. Fellow students need to come to the office to pick something up. Ellie Broderick and Beckett Cybers. Congratulations to our boys B squad. They won the consolation bracket this weekend of their tournament, and they brought home a big old trophy. Congratulations, boys basketball B squad. You did awesome. Cyber League Royals, you would have noticed you had baby bottles in your classrooms, and I'm sure your teachers have talked to you about this, but we want to fill up those baby bottles with any change that we have at home to help the Women's Care Center and the women that can't afford things that they need for their babies. So we want to fill up those baby bottles, bring change tomorrow, any loose change at home that you have, or maybe from your piggy bank, if you can spare a few, that would be great. A little can go a long way. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a wonderful afternoon. Remember to be kind, be brave, believe, be strong and courageous. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
So we have the legislative branch that makes the laws, the legislative laws. Now we have the executive branch.
The White House. Executive. Enforces laws. President. Vice President. Cabinet.
So executive enforces the laws. They say this is what should be happening in our country. The executive branch enforces, and then the judicial.
The U.S. Supreme Court. Judicial, interprets laws. Supreme Court, other federal courts.
So the judicial interprets the law. You're breaking the law. You're guilty, right? They are interpreting it. Did they follow the law or did they break the law? So that judicial in the courts with the judges are determining, they're interpreting the law. So you need to fill in those three branches and what each branch does. Now on the backside, we're going to do question number 6 today.
Minnesota becomes a territory. In 1848, 61 men met in the growing lumber town of Stillwater along the St. Croix River. Women were not yet allowed to vote. The men agreed to send a delegate or representative to Washington, D.C. Successful fur trader Henry Sibley from Mendota was chosen. He would go to the U.S. Congress and request a new territory called Minnesota be created. If approved, a governor would be appointed to lead the territory. The citizens would be able to elect representatives to a territorial legislature that would make laws for Minnesota. They would also be allowed to create their own judicial courts that would decide whether people had broken those laws. Becoming a territory was the first step to becoming a state.
So question number 6 says, what were the advantages of becoming a territory? Why did we want to become a territory? There is a plural S, advantages. So list more than one reason, one thing they got to do because they became a territory. So there are several things they're able to do now that they become a territory. So list some of those things that they get to do as a territory.
The settlers had to wait about 6 months for Congress to answer their request. Members of Congress argued about where to draw the boundaries for the new territory. Finally, in the spring of 1849, Congress passed a law establishing Minnesota as a U.S. territory. Now the citizens could send an elected delegate to Congress. Again, Minnesotans chose Henry Sibley. The territory's other important officer was a governor, but Minnesotans didn't get to choose him. The President of the United States did that. President Zachary Taylor appointed Alexander Ramsey. He lived in Pennsylvania, but he soon moved to Minnesota to serve as territorial governor.
So the first territorial governor was Alexander Ramsey.
Both Ramsey and Sibley played important roles in Minnesota's development over the following years. One of their first goals was to get the Dakota to give up their lands in southern Minnesota. They achieved that goal in 1851 with the signing of the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota.
So we became a territory in 1849. The first thing they wanted to do was get more land so they could get more people. That happens with 1851 with the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. They're able to get Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. They're able to get all of that land from the Dakota, so all those thousands upon thousands of settlers can move into the Minnesota territory. So we should be done through number 6. If you need to bring your book home, bring your book home. Otherwise, put your paper into your file folder so we do not lose it. Put your paper with your name on it in your file folder. Books go back on the shelf. If you are listening to this at home, I hope you are well, and I hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day.